Okay, this is looking good to me. Does this look right to you? You can just see one big picture? Okay, all right. So tonight we're talking about an exciting new acquisition that we acquired at the end of last year that sadly only, I guess, a handful of us who are on staff have actually had a chance to see. This story is about Mary Macomber's An Instrument of Many Strings, an 1897 painting by an American artist. But as you can imagine, as some of you will imagine quickly, when I saw it, I thought immediately of our Pre-Raphaelites and felt like it was a great fit for our collection. This story begins at the American Art Fair. I was doing one of those things that used to be such a normal thing to do. I hopped on a train and went up to New York City to see art at an art fair. It was a really good show this year. There were actually lots of women artists. You see this incredible tapestry here by Margaretta Zorak. But what really caught my eye was this painting that you came here to learn about tonight. Mary Lizzie Macomber's An Instrument of Many Strings. It was at the Vose Galleries booth. Vose Galleries is an old dealer in Boston. They were actually Macomber's dealer in her lifetime. So they sell most of her work still that gets sold is through them. I was so excited when I saw it that not only did I snap that super professional photo I just showed you, but I emailed it to Margaretta from a taxi cab in New York on my way to see another exhibition. I was like, this is so cool. Just letting her know that I had seen this work. And why was I so excited? I was so excited because in my brain, Mary Lizzie Macomber's painting just reminded me so much, so immediately, just because of the subject matter and the perspective of it, the viewpoint of the work of Dante Gabriel Rossetti, our Veronica Veronese, a work from the Bancroft collection, and I immediately wondered if she could have known about it. It also reminded me, when I looked a little bit closer, in a very different way, of the work of Edward Burne-Jones, also in our collection. And here you see The Council Chamber by Burne-Jones. What reminded me of Burne-Jones, not so much the composition or the subject, the coloration, this kind of sagey green, and also a really beautiful close-up here, the kind of the brushwork. And then here you see the Macomber, and here you see the Burne-Jones. So this is what, this is the other connection I kind of made immediately in my brain. Didn't know if there was much validity to it, but I did know a little bit about Mary Lizzie Macomber because we have this wonderful work, which some of you who've been to the museum have probably seen. This is Rosamond the Fair. It's a much later work by Macomber from 1915, and it's after she's really changed her style. She's been to Europe, and she is working in a style that's influenced more by old masters, although she's still doing similar subject matter. And you can certainly still feel that pre-Raphaelite influence, but she's also been looking at Titian. She's been looking at Leonardo da Vinci. She's developed this, she called it a sfumato style, a very soft, hazy type of painting, which is quite different from the first, from An Instrument of Many Strings, which is from 17 years earlier. A little bit about Mary Lizzie Macomber. She was born in Fall River, Massachusetts, not far from Boston. And every bio of her written in her lifetime mentions that she is descended from Pilgrims and Quakers. She studied with a local painter in Fall River, Robert Dunning. She studied, he was a still life painter, so she mostly studied still life first. Then she heads to Boston, where she goes to the museum school. And she studies figure painting there for a couple of years because that's what she's interested in doing. She suffers some illness in her second year there and leaves school for a while, and then comes back and is studying with Frank Duvnik, actually. So a more famous American painter. And what does her Boston art world look like? Macomber's Boston art world was one of great refinement and gentility. Most of the Boston art scene was revolving around the Museum of Fine Arts, its school, as well as Dahl and Richards Gallery, where this work was first shown, and those galleries. So there's a couple dealers, there's one big museum and school, and the styles. So when she's getting going in the late 1880s and early 1890s, this is a period when American artists are very actively looking at Europe. Most really ambitious American artists want to go to Europe to study. And this is the work of Thomas Wilmer Dewing, and he paints this in Boston right after he returns from studying in Paris. But interestingly, critics of the time didn't link it to French art, but linked it to the British Pre-Raphaelites, specifically to Burne-Jones, which is probably one of the reasons that this work is a great fit for our collection. Boston is also a city, not just a city that appreciates European training, but also a city that really pioneers the taste for Impressionism in the US. Boston was much more supportive of Impressionist artists. Childe Hassam was one of the first to really bring back a truly Impressionist influenced style in the mid 1880s to Boston, and he's doing these wonderful paintings of Boston. This is my favorite Hassam style, actually, is the work he does early in Boston in the 1880s. Boston is also a city that really supports women artists, much more so than New York or Philadelphia at the time. There are these groups of women artists who are supporting each other, and they're really a part of the Boston art world. One of those artists is Lilia Cabot Perry, and her wonderful self-portrait that's in our collection. She is both a woman artist, a woman of great education and gentility, and also an artist who's influenced by Impressionism. She actually befriends Monet and paints at Giverny for I think 7 summers. So, and when she shows this work in 1891, also the first year that Mary Lizzie Macomber would show professionally, when she shows this work, Child in Window, it is described as being an interesting mingling of French Impressionism and British Pre-Raphaelite painting. I have no idea what they're talking about, but maybe Margaretta can help us get at that a little later. I definitely see the Impressionism. So Macomber, so as I said, she starts showing in 1891, showing in big juried salon style shows where there's lots of artists, applying, and then you get accepted and you get hung. And her work is not just accepted to sort of the local shows in Boston. She exhibits in the Fine Arts Building at the 1893 World's Columbian Exposition, which was a massive World's Fair in Chicago. And the Fine Arts Building was huge. And there was a women's building, but she shows in the Fine Arts Building. And she's also showing in the big juried shows in New York and Philadelphia. In 1892, 93, 94, she's showing at the National Academy of Design. She's showing at the Pennsylvania Academy. She shows at the Carnegie Institute. And I pull out particularly the National Academy of Design in New York at this period, and the Pennsylvania Academy, because we know that Samuel Bancroft, who collected the museum's Pre-Raphaelites, his collection was shown in New York at the Century Club and in Philadelphia at the Pennsylvania Academy in 1892-93. So I really think she could have seen his work, specifically, the things he owned. This is an important painting for her, her St. Catherine. It wins the Dodge Prize, which was the prize for the best work by a woman artist at the National Academy of Design in 1897, and then is given to the Museum of Fine Arts Boston the following year. It, to me, is very British art looking. It reminds me of things I have seen by Albert Moore, things, just Alma Tadema, not maybe as Pre-Raphaelite-ish, but definitely kind of British art. But again, I'm going to leave that mostly to the expert. I'm just going to make some random links to British paintings, and then Margaretta can tell you what's really happening with British art in the US. So Instrument of Many Strings is sort of her next year. She does kind of like a big painting every year that she shows at a bunch of places. And this one she sends in 98. She paints it in 97. In 98, she sends it to National Academy of Design, Pennsylvania Academy of the Fine Arts, and the Worcester Art Museum, all for their annual exhibitions. The painting, one of the things people notice about it, of course, is its reference actually to ancient art. The woman is playing what appears to be a kithara, or a version of a kithara, and here's some ancient Greek ceramics, so people point out that. Although she may have come at it through British artists who are actually looking and reproducing ancient subject matter, like Lawrence Alma-Tadema, whose wonderful piece Sappho and Alcaeus is here. And the similarities between the actual style of this kithara that he has and the one that she has in her painting are pretty striking. So it seems like there's all sorts of fun links with her. And now I'm just going to show you a bunch of, I'm going to sort of give you some of the later part of her career after the painting that we acquired, and just show you some comparisons with some British things that I think are of interest. So this is Macomber's Night and Her Daughter Sleep from 1902. And when I first saw this, I was doing like a Google image search on my screen, and it came up, and I immediately thought of this wonderful study for the head of Nimue in the Beguiling of Merlin, which is an Edward Burne-Jones in the Delaware Art Museum's collection. Just the position of that neck in there was so key. And she keeps showing these kind of, you'll notice, instrument of many strings, Night and Her Daughter Sleep. Early on, she's showing more familiar stories like the Annunciation. She begins to invent her own stories, her own allegories. And this is something she was very much praised for at the time. People really liked this. They thought it was incredibly inventive. It also leads to a great deal of confusion for us now because we don't entirely know what some of these stories are. Some of them are definitely not your familiar, Greek mythology that you might expect, or Shakespeare or a literary subject. They're actually things she invented, and they're and they can be quite striking, but also quite strange stories. A very similar approach to the neck here, and yet another woman with an instrument here is Memory Comforting Sorrow. This is actually the second version of this painting. Mary Lizzie Macomber originally painted it around 1903, 1904. And then her studio was in a big artist studio building that had a fire, a pretty dramatic fire where lots of artists lost a lot of work. And she apparently and one other artist had to be pulled out the window. So it was a pretty raging fire. And this is a painting she actually repainted a couple of years later after that. And then it was sold to the Fall River Public Library. A lot of what I have been able to find about Mary Lizzie Macomber comes from Fall River. Thank goodness the Fall River's local newspaper has been digitized because, man, she was the local girl made good. There are so many stories about everything that happens. You hear about how she's in Boston, you hear about how she's in New York. They really chronicle her life as she's sort of a local subject. I have seen, but I didn't put in here, a picture of the earlier version of Memory Comforting Sorrow. And the face isn't quite as directly looking like hers as it is here. I included this portrait of Macomber because I think that this version of Memory Comforting Sorrow, she's probably working from her own image. That very strong profile you see with her neck and her chin and her nose there really looks a lot like her. She is said to have painted almost always from a model. In this case, perhaps that model was herself. Just a couple of, again, continuing on my just making random links to things that it looks like that happen to be my pre-refs. So here is Macomber's study for Isabella. The actual larger painting that this is a study for is at the Museum of Fine Arts, Boston, but they don't have a color image. Fall River Historical Society, proud of their local daughter, does have an image. And Margaretta actually was the one who pointed out to me that how much this reminded her of George Frederick Watts's Hope, a work at the Tate. And I also think that the harp or instrument that Watts is painting, the figure is holding, is very similar to this instrument. There are a lot of pictures of women with instruments in the late 19th century. Women are looking at prints, they're looking at books, and they're holding instruments, not always playing them. This is almost like a cliche of what late 19th century academic painting really looks like. And finally, Macomber's Three Muses from 1914. After about 1910, 11, she doesn't do as many of these multi-figure subjects. She begins to do more portraits and more single figures, like our Rosamund the Fair. But this is an example of one that she does. And here compared, again, with Margaretta's help, to Rossetti's The Beloved, with this sort of cluster of figures with these very sweet faces. And with that rapid fire introduction to Macomber and sort of trying to situate our work within her career and within her interest in British art, I will turn this over to Margaretta. I'm going to keep running the slideshow and she's just going to tell me what to do.
Thank you, Heather. Now, can everyone hear me? Are we good? That's some nodding. Excellent. Okay, so I have to say I was potentially even more excited about this painting when Heather sent me the email than she was, because I'm really interested in how British Pre-Raphaelitism translated to America. So I'm going to give a quick run through of that, and I'm going to start way before Macomber was even born, just to give you an idea of how Americans heard about, read about, or saw British Pre-Raphaelite art, as a way of explaining maybe how it came to be in the way it did in America. So Heather, first slide. I'm going to start in the 1850s with a journal. The journal is called the Crayon. It lasted from 1855 to 1861, and it was co-founded and co-edited by William James Stillman, who may be familiar to some of you. He was the American artist, journalist, friend of John Ruskin and all of the Pre-Raphaelites, and more importantly, married to British Pre-Raphaelite artist Marie Spartali Stillman. So he was very steeped in the kind of Pre-Raphaelite aesthetic, and more importantly, in the writings of John Ruskin. And you can see on this otherwise not very interesting image of the first issue of the Crayon, and I've outlined in red there a quote from none other than John Ruskin, which reads in typical Ruskinian obfuscation: "Whence, in fine, looking to the whole kingdom of organic nature, we find that our full receiving of its beauty depends first on the sensibility and then on the accuracy and touchstone faithfulness of the heart in its moral judgment." And indeed, the Crayon was very much a literary journal. In fact, there were no images, and very much influenced by the writing of John Ruskin. So what American audiences got was maybe not so much what Pre-Raphaelite art looked like, but what the kind of underlying zeitgeist was in terms of Pre-Raphaelite art. So, next slide. They got to see a little bit about what Pre-Raphaelite art looked like in 1857, when an exhibition of British art toured the East Coast of the United States, in New York at the National Academy of Design, in Philadelphia, Boston, and Washington, D.C. Now, the exhibition was organized by a very optimistic British entrepreneur. He managed to snag William Michael Rossetti into helping him, largely probably because he knew if he could get some Pre-Raphaelite paintings into this big British art show. The Pre-Raphaelites then were in their, kind of early moment. They were still quite controversial and avant-garde, and that might attract audiences to his show. However, even people as married to the idea of British Pre-Raphaelitism as William James Stillman criticized the exhibition in the Crayon, largely for what he felt were second-rate examples of some of the artwork in the exhibition. The other thing that was a real problem with this exhibition is it included very little Pre-Raphaelite art. Granted, painters like William Holman Hunt Thomas Woolner, the sculptor who was part of the original Brotherhood, Ford Madox Brown, and even one work by Lizzie Siddall were included in the show. But for the most part, the big guns, the paintings that we would consider, quintessentially Pre-Raphaelite, were excluded. I'm just showing you two examples of pieces that were in the show. On the left, Anna Blunden, who was a female artist, but whose painting I include because it is an example of that kind of modern moral subject that the early Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood members were so interested in portraying. In this case, the kind of extreme conditions under which these women were paid to sew for the industrial economy, often working in tenement houses for very low pay. And here she is literally praying for something a bit better. And on the right, I show you a work by Arthur Hughes, who was, if not in the immediate Pre-Raphaelite circle, certainly within the wider Pre-Raphaelite artist spectrum. And I include it largely because the subject, Fair Rosamond, which of course we also saw in the work of Macomber, is one which the Pre-Raphaelites were particularly interested in painting, largely because Fair Rosamond who is actually a real person. She was the mistress of Henry II. She was the subject of Tennyson's poem, A Dream of Fair Women, or at least one of the subjects. Okay, so but this is in the 1850s. Clearly, Macomber wasn't even born yet, but it's examples such as this, the Crayon in this exhibition, that give Americans their first idea of what Pre-Raphaelite art might be about and what it might look like. Then, Heather, next slide. In the 1860s, a group of artists gathered in New York City. They call themselves the Association for the Advancement of Truth in Art. Quite a name. Today, they're simply referred to as the American Pre-Raphaelites, and some of you may have seen a really fabulous show within the last year and a half. It was at the National Gallery in Washington, which featured the work of the American Pre-Raphaelites. They were very much under the influence of the writings of John Ruskin, particularly his advice to artists who wish to paint the landscape. At the center of this group was an artist named Thomas Charles Farrer. He had studied at he was born in England. He studied at the Working Men's College in London, where both Dante Gabriel Rossetti and John Ruskin taught. And this work, which was completed only shortly after he arrived in America, entitled Gone, Gone, is kind of a typical, slightly Pre-Raphaelite influenced Victorian genre painting. But genre painting and figure painting was really not what the American Pre-Raphaelites were all about. In fact, they were very much about the landscape. If I could just have the next slide. And in particular, the landscape painted in the way that John Ruskin advocated. So in this really quite stunning work by Fidelia Bridges, very closely observed this milkweed plant and depicted in exquisite detail. So that's what they were really all about. I think it's interesting that also there were female members of this group. So even in the 1870s, women were at least theoretically able to participate in the art world, and certainly within this group of painters who were so much inspired by the Pre-Raphaelites. If I could have the next slide. But Macomber is really tapping into a very different aspect of Pre-Raphaelitism. And in this painting, it's a perfect example. It's largely figural. The figures are almost exclusively women. And the narrative, which Heather gave a bit of a hint about, is often a bit opaque, even symbolist in its kind of obscure, hard to read messaging. And as Heather also gave a hint about, next slide, this made me think, at least in terms of subject, about George Frederick Watts. And I'm going to use Hope as well. And Hope was one of his paintings which was reproduced so much and so in such great number that it was potentially one of the most recognizable images in the late 19th century. However, the important thing about Watts, particularly in the case of Macomber, is that he was featured in one of the few, if ever, single British artist exhibitions at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in 1884 and 1885. And this show was a huge success. Over 1 million people attended. It was actually extended for 6 months more than it was originally supposed to run for. And we just move to the next slide, that would be great. So, and the reason I think about Watts and Macomber is, but Watts was not a pre-Raphaelite artist per se. In fact, he kind of operated under his own particular theory or theoretical approach. But he was very much about painting these kind of big picture philosophical subjects, like, for instance, an entire painting just about the concept of hope. And if you remember some of the paintings that Heather showed earlier by Lizzie Macomber, Faith, Hope, and Love of 1894, Night and Her Daughter's Sleep, Memory, Comforting Sorrow. I mean, these are titles that Watts could have applied as well to any one of his paintings. So I think, while in terms of subject, Watts might have been the sort of painter that would have been very much inspirational to Lizzie Macomber. In style, maybe there's something a little different going on. And in terms of that, I'd like to think about the work of, next slide, Marie Spartoli Stillman. You will notice that I have cleverly picked an image which has a musical instrument in it. That wasn't by mistake or accident. This is the childhood of Saint Cecily. For those of you who remember about Stillman, she was married to an American, William, who we talked about earlier. And therefore, she launched a kind of two-pronged exhibition attack. She exhibited both in the UK and in the US. In the US, starting around the 1870s and extending through the first decade of the 20th century. And she exhibited at all of the similar places that Lizzie Macomber did. So in Boston, New York, Philadelphia. But in Boston, her presence was doubly noticeable because she had works on view at Dahl and Richards, who were her dealer. Heather mentioned Dahl and Richards as a very kind of prominent Boston dealer, not Lizzie Macomber's dealer. As she mentioned, Lizzie was at both galleries. But that certainly would have been a way that Lizzie could have seen her work. So if we look at these two together, I think, at least for me, what I thought about was the particular softness, the way that Marie Stillman, for instance, in the figure on the left, depicts how the hair lies on the forehead of that woman in that kind of soft way, reminding me very much of what Lizzie's doing here in an instrument of many strings. So there is one other way, which Heather hinted at, that she could have seen real live pre-Raphaelite art, and that would be when Samuel Bancroft, the Wilmington, Delaware collector, whose collection is now on view at the Delaware Art Museum, if the museum was open, decided he needed to put an addition onto his home, and so he needed to send his paintings out and away. And so he allowed his collection to go to both Philadelphia and New York. Now, at this time in 1892, Bancroft collection was only about halfway formed. So not everything, sadly not Veronica Veronese, which Heather and I are really distressed about, was on this tour. But these two paintings were for sure, Lady Lilith on the left and Water Willow on the right, both by Dante Gabriel Rossetti. In addition to this, Samuel Bancroft collected a huge number, over 200, of photographic reproductions of pre-Raphaelite works. And in this exhibition, they were displayed alongside the fine art, the paintings, as if on, you know, the same caliber. This was a relatively new medium, and I think audiences were equally as fascinated by photography as they were about what we would call an original work of art. And one of the works of art that was included in photographic reproduction, next slide please, was the work Heather mentioned earlier, The Beloved. And there is really something about this central figure in the Rossetti that to me is very much in harmony with what Lizzie Macomber is doing in her painting. So that's kind of the end of the what she could have seen part. And I just want to spend a brief moment about the musical instrument, because Heather did take the time to tell you about the ancient heritage. And I just want to talk about the musical instrument and Pre-Raphaelite art. So if we could go to the next slide. From the very earliest days of Pre-Raphaelitism, British Pre-Raphaelitism, the musical instrument is pretty much ubiquitous in their art. And it starts because of a subject they all loved, that of Saint Cecilia. They loved Saint Cecilia because she was, as I think I mentioned, part of a poem by Tennyson. And of course, Tennyson was, God above gods for subject matter for the Pre-Raphaelites. And their interest in this subject starts from very early on. This is an illustration that Dante Gabriel Rossetti did for a mid-1850s book of Tennyson's poems, the Mocks of Tennyson. And from thenceforward, Saint Cecilia and her musical instrument, which is usually with a keyboard of some sort, a harpsichord-ish kind of thing, appears everywhere. So just very quickly, next slide. Here's Burne-Jones painting it in the 70s and in a stained glass window that was repeated in many, many versions over and over again. Next slide. John William Waterhouse, a late Pre-Raphaelite, his Saint Cecilia not only has the keyboarded instrument, but also some strings accompanying. Next slide. Here's Evelyn de Morgan in the 80s with Music, Sweet Music, again, Saint Cecilia. And finally, kind of the last gasp of Pre-Raphaelitism, Strudwick here in his Evensong Saint Cecilia. I apologize for the emblem on the lower right, but it's a stunning painting with an amazing musical instrument. And again, Saint Cecilia. So certainly for Macomber, using the musical instrument, whether the instrument itself was something from ancient times or other, was very much in this kind of Pre-Raphaelite feel, and would almost surely have been a reference to that. So that's the end of my food for thought about Americanism or Pre-Raphaelite in America. And hopefully you have questions. Thank you.
Well, I think it's interesting that they're not just women with instruments. They're women with instruments and plants. They're outside playing all these instruments, as is obviously the instrument of many strings. They're always out in nature with their instruments, or frequently are, unlike Veronica. Just noticing.
I'm getting a question about the size of the artwork. Do you mean that last slide, Pam and Dick? Or the new acquisition, perhaps?
Heather, how big is the piece that we just purchased?
So the new acquisition is, oh goodness, I don't actually have that written down, but it's maybe, it's not huge. It's like a life-size head. It's probably like, it's got a big old frame on it. So it's probably 30 by 20, the actual picture. Yeah, it's not a massive, it is not nearly the scale of the Pre-Raphaelite, of some of our Bancroft's Pre-Raphaelites. You're smarter.
And a comment,
this amazing.
a comment, interesting that the Pre-Raphaelites used so many instruments in their work because there were no composers among them, were there?
Not only no composers, but particularly in the case of Rossetti, limited interest in music. Although there has been more and more written lately about the Pre-Raphaelites and music, and there may still be more to discover there.
And I know in American art, it's so often women and instruments being paired. It's definitely very gendered in American art. Well, there are some portraits of violinists and other, for some reason I'm thinking mostly of violinists, but there are some portraits of like male, musicians in the late 19th century. It's so much more often it's women.
A couple more questions. Is it in the original frame? Do we know, Heather? And if so, who is the frame maker?
We do know it's the original frame because the work is published, or very close to the original frame, probably the original frame. The work is published in 1901, I think, in an article about her, and you see the frame. It's clearly important to her frames. You see other works in a very similar style of frame, obviously made by the same frame maker, who annoyingly, we don't know who it is. There are some fabulous frame makers up there, and it is not by them. Mark Bancroft, our paintings conservator, when he looked at it, he's like, it's a very good frame. It's a very well-made frame, but it is not a known frame maker. So it's interesting. And I haven't found evidence. I haven't really looked that hard, but I wonder if it was Vaux's, because he's already dealing with her work at this point. But I definitely get the feeling that it's her style of frame, because she has multi-panel ones made with those columns sort of dividing them up as well.
Heather, when Samuel Bancroft got frames made for paintings he purchased that did not have their original frames, he used a Boston frame maker.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, we might want to look back and see what we can find.
Speaking of Bancroft, Margaretta, there's a question. Did Samuel Bancroft have a lot of American Pre-Raphaelites in his collection? Or any?
Okay, Heather, what is the name of the American lady artist he collected? Jurvis McIntee. How does he fit?
Sorry. I don't really think of, I was like, I don't really actually think of Jurvis McIntee very often, ever. I'll admit that. And I certainly
example that I can think of. He did collect American art, but he certainly didn't have a Thomas Farrer or yeah.
Yeah, no, and he's in the American art he has. So he's got some local artists. He's got Coyle and he's got Robert Shaw, and then there's the Partingtons. Yeah, very different animals.
Yeah. So probably no.
I don't think so.
And another question, can you speak to how women Pre-Raphaelites were able to be successful in such a stifling time for women?
In England or America?
How about both?
Well, certainly in American art, you start to see more significant women artists in this period. And they're often the sort of local example of the illustrators, the Red Rose Girls. They're often sort of supporting each other. Certainly in Boston, that was a thing. You have these women who are supporting each other in their field. And it's a period where women are entering academies. They're able to paint in this, to get this professional training. By the last quarter of the 19th century, they're able to go to Europe. And one of the books I was reading about Boston women artists was making a point that while academic art, which is the training that was highly available, was going out of fashion in other places, it actually remains in fashion in Boston for quite a while. So these women artists in Boston are able to become an important part of that art world.
Heather, can you speak at all to
and certainly in England, similarly, I mean, this is what the most recent. Sorry.
Go ahead, Margaretta. My apologies.
Oh no. Are you losing?
No worries. Heather mentioned that women in the U.S. kind of tended to come together and support one another, and certainly in Britain this was the same. As a great point was made in the recent Pre-Raphaelite Sisterhood exhibition in London. Very much. Banding together in a kind of an informal way was one way to kind of surmount the barriers of the large paternalistic art world.
There's a question about the subject of the painting. The lady looks to be a saint with the gold around her, and some people commenting that they love the background. Can you tell us more about that?
So she does look like a saint. And when I first saw it, I thought, oh, this must be Saint Cecilia, because some of her paintings actually have multiple titles. And I figured out, I'm like, oh, she showed us Saint Cecilia, but it's a different painting. It's actually, she shows it in 1896 before this one is done. So this is not her Saint Cecilia painting, although she could have been returning to that idea. And certainly her work from the early 1890s, is very religious in tone. She becomes a little more abstract, a little more allegorical generally after that. It's one of the things that's always commented on in reviews of her work during her lifetime, is the fact that this woman from Pilgrim and Quaker stock, that they keep saying she is not Roman Catholic, but she is painting all these saints and religious subjects. So, you know, it is definitely almost a transitional piece where she's going from doing very recognizable saints, here's an Annunciation, to a point where she's starting to develop these allegories of her own. But this work is published with this title repeatedly, so this is definitely its original title, and the only one that I've seen associated with it. The background are these beautifully painted plants, and I do think that that to me is one of the things that maybe didn't register in my conscious mind as being a pre-Raphish thing when I first saw the painting. I was really looking at like the woman and the instrument, and even the tabernacle frame. That's what this style of frame is called. But I think that idea of these, looking at all of Margaretta's slides as she went through them and as we put this together, and even thinking of something as obvious as Lilith with with that rose bower behind her. Yeah, that plant life is really beautiful and really beautifully painted.
Reggie, I see you have a question about one of the other works that may have traveled.
People have questions?
I think the answers came later if we're answering Reggie's question.
Sorry, you guys are breaking up a little for me.